Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful webinar brought to you by NERC about recycling markets in 2021. I'm Lynn Rubenstein, Executive Director of the Northeast Recycling Council. And before we get to the good part, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our generous sponsors that have helped to make the webinar possible. Our gold sponsors are Advanced Drainage Systems and Vanguard Renewables, and silver sponsors are Casella and ISRI. So thank you very much to them. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. The recording and the PowerPoint presentations will be posted on the NERC homepage by tomorrow, and you will get an email from GoToWebinar about that. We do want you to ask questions. We're going to take questions after all the speakers, but we want questions. And you're going to use the question box to do that. In case you're not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, it's somewhere on the right. So either you see the dashboard and there's a little gray bar that says questions, and you do the down arrow and you type into the box and hit return. If you don't see that, there's a little orange arrow at the top of your screen. So you'll click that and that opens the dashboard, and then same thing, you'll find the question box down there. So I'm going to be doing introductions before we get going. So we'll have all that laid out and you'll know who is going to be presenting today. So first of all, I'm delighted to say that our moderator is Chaz Miller. Chaz's career in waste and recycling has spanned 4 decades, with stints at the US EPA Office of Solid Waste and the agency Original Recycling Programs, the Glass Packaging Institute, and the National Waste and Recycling Association. He testified on waste and recycling issues at congressional and state hearings and spoke at conferences around North America. He is a member of the Maryland Recycling Network Board and an ex officio member of the Board of Directors of NERC. Although he is now retired from full-time work, he consults and continues to write his circular file column for Waste 360 and to speak at waste and recycling conferences. He chaired the Montgomery County Aiming for Zero Waste Task Force as it advised the county on its 2020 solid waste plan update. He is a recipient recently of the National Recycling Coalition's Lifetime Achievement Award. And Chaz will give us a few welcoming remarks after I finish the other bios. So following Chaz will be Joe Pickard. He serves as the Chief Economist and Director of Commodities at the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, ISRI, and he's been there since 2010. He has conducted research and analysis on commodity and scrap market developments and the key economic role that recycling plays both in the US and globally. Joe regularly provides economic and recycling market updates to ISRI members, industry associations, policymakers, the press, and other audiences. Before working at ISRI, he served as the economist for the International Copper Study Group in Lisbon, Portugal, very exotic, and as a research analyst at Slayton & Associates in Alexandria, Virginia, as well as research and environmental departments at nonprofits, including the Urban Institute and the Pew Charitable Trust. He holds a master's degree in economics from Virginia Tech and a bachelor's in political science from Loyola University, Maryland. Following Joe will be Tanya Randall. She's a program manager for More Recycling, a consulting and research firm with nearly 20 years of expertise in plastic packaging recycling. She currently supports work on plastic packaging recyclability and is the principal consumer liaison in film and other plastic recycling questions. Tanya received a bachelor's degree in environmental science and policy from Duke University, and she currently serves as the president of the board of directors for the Carolina Recycling Association. And then we're going to hear about paper from Hannah Zhao. Hannah is a senior economist with Recovered Paper Fast Markets RISI. She has specialized in the World Recovered Market papers for Fast Markets RISI since January 2009. She writes for the World Recovered Paper Monitor and RISI's 5-year and 15-year recovered paper forecasts. She also provides single and multi-client studies on recovered paper markets. Hannah holds a master's degree in resource economics from the University of Rhode Island. So I'm really delighted to have you all here with us today, and thank you so very, very much. And Chaz, with that, I'm going to make Joe the presenter and welcome you to give us a few introductory remarks.
Just want to thank everybody for being here on this webinar. I think we have an excellent panel of speakers. I'm looking forward to all I think I will be learning today, and I know it's going to be a lot. And with that, I urge you to send in your questions. And my understanding is, yes, the slides will be available a day or two or three after this webinar. But Joe, take it away. Thank you.
Sooner than that, but yes.
Great. Thanks very much, Chaz and Lynn. And thanks to NERC for putting this webinar together and for the kind invitation to speak with you all today. I'll try to keep these remarks relatively brief, as one will leave time at the end, certainly for the Q&A portion. But just wanted to give kind of a 30,000 foot look at the overview of the economic developments and outlook going forward, and how that's impacting recycling and commodity markets in 2021. Okay, so all right, we'll start with the most recent economic numbers. Actually, the Bureau of Economic Analysis just released the fourth quarter and full year 2020 GDP numbers this morning, showing that the U.S. economy actually contracted 3.5% in 2020, despite sharper growth in the third quarter and a 4% increase in the fourth quarter. Looking into 2021, certainly lots of unknowns, and the biggest part of that certainly the impacts of the COVID pandemic on the U.S. economy and the global economy as well. Even with so many uncertainties regarding the influence of the pandemic on economic growth. And Chad, I think I hear your chuckling maybe a little in the background. I don't know if that, okay. Anyway, the expectation from the Federal Reserve, despite all the pandemic worries, is that real GDP is actually going to rebound over 4% this year, and that unemployment in the United States is going to drop from 6.7% currently to about 5% in 2021. And just yesterday, the Federal Reserve issued its latest policy statement saying that certainly the COVID pandemic is causing tremendous human and economic hardship across the U.S. and around the world. The pace of the recovery in economic activity and employment has moderated in recent months, and we've seen that in the GDP number, with weakness concentrated in sectors most adversely affected by the pandemic. And we'll talk a little bit about what those sectors are. But just in terms of corporate expectations with respect to COVID, the Conference Board's latest survey of their CEOs, which was done in the fourth quarter, shows the expectations if you're following online, in the sort of darker red bars on this graph, where 41% of CEOs expected that their business will recover in 2021, 27% expect it to recover in 2022, and about 6% don't expect it to recover until 2023 or later. But different sectors certainly of the economy have performed differently. On the health of the industrial sector and manufacturing, most of the indicators have been pretty positive in the United States, and that shows up in the latest industrial production numbers, and also in the manufacturing PMI numbers, which I want to just take a minute to go through by some of the key sectors, because these are really the key sources of demand for raw materials, and by extension, by recycled commodities as well. So one of the, especially for the metals sector, the outlook for the transportation equipment industry is very important. The survey respondent from the ISM manufacturing report said that COVID-19 outbreaks are causing supply chain issues for Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. More work needs to ensure suppliers keep in the loop with any problem in their supply chain, but end customer demand for products is keeping production and future outlook positive. I won't read all of these, but a couple of the key ones, I think, especially for our conversation today. If you look at the fabricated metal product sector, they're saying current business outlook is strong through the first quarter of 21, and they're expecting a 20% increase in sales growth for this year. Looking at some of the other
Joe, sorry, what does PMI stand for?
I'm sorry. So that's the Purchasing Manufacturers Index. It's a survey that these groups do. The main one in the United States is the Institute for Supply Management. And every month they're surveying the purchasing managers, the people who are actually making the purchases for their organization, and polling them on their expectations for the health of their companies going forward. Does that help at all?
Thank you.
Sure. And just so you know, the PMIs are done basically on a scale. If you can see the chart on the right-hand side of the screen, the 50 line separates economic expansion from contraction. So any number over 50 signaling expansion in the manufacturing sector. The latest number for December was 60.7, which is quite healthy. Okay, a couple of other sectors of interest for you, hopefully, from the plastics and rubber products. Again, suppliers are having difficulty finding and retaining labor, leading to supply constraints. And that's certainly a recurring theme, both in terms of supply chain, but also in difficulties with the labor market. And we'll talk about those well, we'll start right now. So the labor market in the United States, I think, the indicators certainly much better than they were when they were during the real depth of the downturn in the second quarter of last year, when initial unemployment claims spiked to levels that we had never seen before in this country, 6.8 million at its worst. Prior to this pandemic-induced downturn, initial unemployment claims, which is the number of people who are filing for unemployment claims for the first time every week, they were typically around 200 to 250,000 per week. That was where we were on average. Massive spike at the outset of the COVID pandemic. Even today, we're looking at initial unemployment claims between about 850 and 900,000 for the most recent weeks, which again, compared to the pre-pandemic levels, extremely elevated. And that has large repercussions because when fewer people, employed, that's going to be a drag on growth, and it's going to be a drag particularly on personal spending, which is the largest component of U.S. GDP. So, from the scrap recyclers that we hear from as ISRI members, the labor market is problematic, not just in terms of the number of people who are unemployed, but also in terms of difficulties trying to hire and retain qualified workers. And that's a problem that is likely to continue well into this year and beyond. Connected to that issue are supply chain issues. When you have the manufacturing base in the United States and around the world shut down for, approximately 2 months, because supply chains are so globally integrated, that's going to have, longer term repercussions. And that's what we're seeing today across a variety of sectors, including electronics. And that's important not just for the electronics and computer industries, but for other industries too. When you look at transportation, for example, so much of modern vehicles today are, electronics, that the shortages that we're seeing in semiconductors and computer chips is actually currently having a drawdown in terms of automobile production right now, and also the number of workers that need to be idled because a lot of these auto producers can't get the component parts that they need to produce cars. And that actually showed up as well in the recent PMI report from IHS Markit, where they say significant supply chain delays, raw material shortage, and evidence of stockpiling at goods producers has pushed up input prices. And the rate of cost inflation was the fastest they've seen since April 2018. And I think for a number of commodities, December and well into January, we saw prices increasing quite sharply for primary commodities, but also for recycled commodities as well. And that's reflected in the producer price indexes that are reported actually by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. On this chart, they show that in the month of December, basically all producer price indexes for recycled goods were up for the month. Aluminum and copper-based scrap were up, close to around 10% just for the month of December. Iron and steel scrap was up about 26% for the month of December, and then increased even more sharply in January. Even prices for recyclable plastics were reportedly up 5%, and were up about 15% for recyclable paper. And of note for the recyclable paper, and this is actually just a brief aside. The Bureau of Labor Statistics used to refer to that price series as waste paper. They got some feedback actually from some of our members that we don't use the term waste paper anymore, that recyclable paper it would be the correct term. And the BLS actually changed their terminology early in 2020 in response. And now that price series is officially known as recyclable paper as opposed to waste paper. That's a brief aside. Anyway, that price series for the year, December 2020 as compared to December 2019, actually up more than 61%. And I'm sure Hannah will have some things to say about the underlying causes for the increases in paper and paperboard production. That's what's kind of been happening in the United States and commodity markets here. Just wanted to turn briefly to the overall global economic outlook. And these numbers were just recently updated by the International Monetary Fund as well. For 2021, the IMF is looking for a 5.5% rebound in global growth, following a 3.5% contraction last year. And most of that is due to expected faster growth in emerging and developing economies, which are expected to grow 6.3%, whereas the advanced economies like the United States are expected to grow at a slower rate, although still positive growth in line with what the Fed was saying for the U.S. economic outlook. And that's important when we're looking at the relative strength of domestic market demand versus export market demand. The expectation is that export markets will grow faster. And in fact, after a 10% contraction in global trade flows in 2020, and I know these are a lot of numbers, but happy to take any questions about them after this. After a 10% contraction basically in global trade last year, the IMF is expecting global trade flows to increase 8% in 2021. And that 10% contraction in global trade flows is pretty consistent with what we saw in the trend with U.S. Scrap exports. And so I just want to go through those quickly by commodity. Ferrous scrap exports had one of the stronger performances amongst the major commodity groups last year. Even though it was flat basically year on year through November, we saw significant increases in purchases from Turkey, which is our largest overseas ferrous scrap market, with shipments there up over 11%. There was a rebound at the end of the year in Mexican demand, up nearly 22% after a pretty sharp contraction in Mexican industrial production, again, as a result of the COVID pandemic. I won't go through all these export markets, but going through the different major commodities. Copper scrap exports from the U.S. were down about 12% in 2020, again, through November, the most recent data available. China actually saw an increase in the volume of higher quality copper scrap coming out of the United States into China. And with the new standards for high quality copper, brass, and aluminum scrap imports, we expect to see continued strength in shipments of those higher quality packages again to China. And we're seeing that movement taking place currently. In terms of market losses last year, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and India were the three largest drops volume-wise in terms of copper scrap demand globally. Again, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but happy to take any questions you might have subsequently. In terms of growth markets for aluminum scrap last year, the top three growth markets were Malaysia, India, and Thailand. And unlike with copper, our shipments of aluminum scrap to mainland China were down over 50% last year. But even with that, China really remains the economic driver, particularly in East Asia. And so even as direct shipments to China were falling, Chinese aluminum demand at the end of the day is still the main driver for the region. I'm not going to dwell too much on this. I don't want to cut into my colleagues' time or space, but just quickly, recovered paper and fiber shipments down about 15% through November last year. Plastic scrap exports from the United States down nearly 8% again through the first 11 months of 2020 year on year. Just a recap of the major market. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on China, and we'll probably be talking about that, I would expect, a little bit later in the session. But this is the longer-term trend in monthly shipments of total scrap exports to mainland China from the United States. So this includes ferrous and non-ferrous metals, paper, plastics, textiles, other commodities. And the trend is pretty clear. We have seen signs of improved demand on some of those non-ferrous metals from China, like we talked about. China's also revised their import standards for ferrous scrap. China has not traditionally been a major ferrous scrap importer from the United States, but those revised standards do open the door for potentially more shipments of ferrous scrap to China. The other major market that we tend to talk about quite a bit is India, and this is the annual and year-to-date trade flows of, again, all scrap commodities to India. We did see a significant contraction in 2020, due in part to issues at the ports and also COVID-related shutdowns. Would expect some of those commodities to see a rebound to India in 2021. But transportation headaches continue to pose problems for scrap exporters, and we hear a lot about this from our ISRI members, especially difficulties associated with container markets in the United States right now. Containers are in short supply, and there are considerable price increases in terms of container rates between Asia and the United States and other markets. So for a number of shipping lines, they've been more concerned with getting those boxes back to Asia, where the prices are dramatically higher to ship from Asia to the United States than the return route. And so that's caused issues in terms of scrap exporters not having access to the containers that they need at the port. But there are also problems associated with shortages in truck drivers too, and trucking availability. And ISRI late last year actually had a webinar specific to trucking, where we had Bob Castell, the chief economist from the American Trucking Association, talk about the outlook for trucking. And the expectation is that the truck driver shortages that we're experiencing aren't expected to go away anytime soon. And through 2028, through their forecasting, they're actually expecting the truck driver shortage to get worse, not better. So sorry for that piece of bad news. But just to kind of recap the major themes I think that we're looking at for 2021, obviously COVID is the major determinant of economic and manufacturing growth going forward, and still so much uncertainty there. I would say that markets did respond positively to the U.S. election results, but I know a lot of recyclers are still concerned about potential tax and regulatory changes that could be coming up. Again, I'm not going to read all of these, but maybe just going to the highlighted sections, sort of, challenges and opportunities that we're seeing. In terms of challenges, certainly supply constraints, labor shortages, transport problems, regulatory costs, and issues with respect to trade restrictions are still major themes for this year. We're also looking at increased legislative activity at the state and local levels with respect to recycling, and that's expected to remain a key feature for 2021. But I think on the plus side, as a result of not just COVID, but I think the general trend is that the educational attempts and the awareness about the need for sustainable development, environmental protection, and climate change means that the role of recycling to accomplish those environmental goals, I think, is really starting to gain traction in terms of public awareness. And that's definitely a positive going forward. And I think for ISRI, educating the public, the policymakers and the press and other stakeholders is going to be a key goal, continues to be a key goal for us. And then the last point just being that recycling is certainly a shared responsibility that requires collaboration across both the public and the private sectors. And with that, I'll wrap it up. This is my contact information. If you have any questions for me, I'd be more than happy to take them either now or in the future. Feel free to either shoot me an email or give me a call. Cell phone is best because we're all still working from home these days. But thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Joe. That was terrific. I'm now going to make Tanya the presenter. Make presenter. And we should be good there. Great. Thank you, Joe. And we're looking forward now to Tanya.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, and you should be seeing my slideshow. Amazing how technology works.
All true. All true.
All right. Well, thanks, Joe, for a great lead in on this. And I'm just going to add specific to plastics some details about what we're seeing in the current market, and also kind of what we're seeing looking forward as drivers for plastics as a commodity. Obviously, I'm with More Recycling. And our vision is we're really we pride ourselves on gathering data and really trying to make engagement and collaboration work across industry, and really raising awareness both for consumers, policymakers, governments, trade associations. And we've done this through research and working on core projects like our tubes work, and also really working on the development of web-based tools. So here's kind of in a nutshell, we do the annual plastics recycling survey and help write those reports and do the data analysis behind that. We've been working on plastic squeeze tubes as a core project with key funders, as well as really working to take the information that we have and the data that we collect and building new tools that really help drive action, like circularity in action and the Buy Recycled Products Directory. And so just to give a little context, this is kind of what we're talking about. We hear a lot about plastics and the challenges of plastics, and where plastics recycling fits in the whole scheme of things. And I just want to point out that plastics is a very small percentage of the whole kind of material collected at the MRF. So paper and then the other materials like glass and metals are the vast majority of what we're seeing coming through the MRF, and plastics are just a very small amount. But of the plastics, this is kind of the breakdown that we see between film, non-bottle rigid, HDPE bottles, and PET bottles. And this film percentage is not necessarily material collected at the MRF, because through our annual survey, we are surveying exporters, recyclers, reclaimers, converters, processors. So a lot of that film doesn't necessarily come through the MRF, and actually most of it isn't. It's coming through commercial channels or through return to retail or ag film and that sort of thing, just to clarify that. But at the bottom of this, you'll see the change between 2017 and 2018. We saw growth in PET recycling, but HDPE bottles, non-bottle rigids, and film all fell from 2017 to 2018. And we are still working on the 2019 data and the reporting for that. So that information will be forthcoming. So all of the data points within my presentation that are charts about recycling are related to 2018 data. But what I can tell you is, looking forward to 2021 and beyond, a lot of times looking behind us and looking at historical pricing really lets you see that these are very obviously commodities, and prices fluctuate and market strength fluctuates. And so the dark background is the price of oil, and then the various commodities are key pieces of plastic recycling that we see coming through a lot of residential collection and MRF grade material, and not necessarily commercial, although commercial film is listed on here. PET A grade, which would be deposit return materials. So just for your reference, because I'm sure you can't read the bottom, HDPE natural bottles are kind of the teal green color at the very top. As you can see, has been a significant kind of workhorse within the last couple of years of really a lot of strength that's tied really directly to the fact that there is a lessening supply of this material. We're seeing a lot less of it in milk jugs and dairy containers, because we're not only shifting away from dairy to non-dairy alternatives, but a lot of dairy is even shifting into other packaging. And so there's still a really significant demand for HDPE natural, but we're seeing less supply of it. And then the next line down is the orange color, which is PET bottles A grade. So that's going to be typically deposit return materials. The peach color grade is polypropylene, which we call small rigids, so tubs, lids, yogurt containers, and that sort of stuff. The gray line at the bottom is mixed retail film, so that's going to be material that both consumers take back to the front of the house, as well as what's collected at the back of the store, and as well as could be combined with distribution center film within the retail stream. And then the light green line at the bottom is 3 through 7s, bottles and small rigids. And what I really want to point out is, Joe was talking about that there had been some growth in plastics and kind of year-over-year trends, but what we see is that not all plastics are recycled equally, and we don't see the same challenges for every sector. And so HDPE natural has always been really strong. PET bottles have also really been strong, but PET thermoforms may have a different outcome, and colored HDPE bottles may have an outcome that's different. And as well with 3 through 7 bottles, a lot of the markets for that have really evaporated, but there are places around the United States that really do have demand, and they do have processors for that. And so this is a very broad scope about plastic recycling. And so where you are and kind of the markets that you see really depends on a really regional and local approach to what you have available. So I just wanted to make sure that this is a national kind of conversation, but very different things happen in very different places depending on what you're talking about specifically. But what we do see is over the last 10 years or so is that we've seen a trend of more domestic recycling capacity coming online and less material being exported. But what we are still lacking is the fact that we're not on the scale of growth of plastics in general. And so even though we're seeing these positive trends for domestic recycling and less material being exported, we still have a lot more plastic coming into the ecosystem and into the process that we don't have the capacity. And so, this just gives you a breakdown as well, percent exported by category. You can see there's a difference of, there was still, even in 2018, a lot of film and non-bottle rigids recycled and that were exported, whereas PET and HDPE bottle capacity has very much been here in the United States. And when we talk about domestic, a lot of time we're talking North America, principally the U.S. and Canada, but it also involves some material that might be being shipped to Mexico. But when we talk about export, it's very much the idea that it's being shipped off of the continent. And so here's some high-level market trends. I will not read all of these. I'm assuming that everybody is perfectly capable to read for themselves. But highlights, one of the things is, they are commodities, prices fluctuate, and market strength fluctuates over time, as well as where you are. Like I said, if a processing plant opens, if one closes, if it shifts to another location. And we know that HDPE is in short supply, but we don't see the same drivers for colored HDPE bottles, so laundry detergent bottles and shampoo bottles. And so those, the prices are soft for that, even though they're both HDPE, the kind of bottles that they are really does make a difference, or containers as well. But PET bottles, there's a steady marching forward with pricing, and we really are waiting for brand commitments and policies like we've seen in California related to recycled content mandates for the CRV packaging, which is the deposit bottle bill PET bottles, to really drive up usage and to drive a demand surge, which is also probably going to drive up prices. And in talking to some of our colleagues in California, we're anticipating that to come probably later this year and early into 2022, where we really start to see more of an impact on these commitments and mandates to really drive up PET bottle prices. But PET thermoforms in reverse are problematic in bottle bales, and they really are lacking demand as a separate commodity. So you don't necessarily see the same growth and predictions of strength in that part of the sector for PET. And again, mixed rigid bales, they continue to struggle because the additional cost to process those furthers the price difference between virgin, and regional markets are really limited. And then again, clear film and mixed retail film grades are showing growth in collection, whereas other grades like ag and mixed materials are not growing at the same. Mixed film materials are not growing at the same rate. Polypropylene markets and are steady, and prices are relatively flat, but we are seeing a little bit of an uptick in early 2021. But the piece that I really want to, talk about is that externalities and subsidies and the impact that other things outside of just the control of recycling and the recycling value chain and the impact that that has. And what you can see here really clearly is the cost of virgin, which is on the far right, compared to the cost of recycled plastics. And so you can see, that virgin, spot price is about 50 cents. And if you look at colored HDPE, which is either color sorted or not, that's comparable in price, but it's not necessarily comparable in quality. And so you can't necessarily make a clear HDPE bottle out of a colored HDPE, recycle it, out of a pellet or whatever. And so to get to the point where you're looking at natural, that can go into a lot more things, and especially natural that's at food grade, it's roughly $1. Therefore, it's about twice as expensive as virgin. And that's one of the real drivers of recycling in the US, is that these outside forces on pricing, and we can't expect the recycling processes to close the gap. It's got to be that we have to think about the drivers of what makes the price of virgin so unnaturally and artificially low. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that there's $1 trillion of global fossil fuel subsidies going in kind of every year that kind of helps drive the cost of plastic and keep it down. And so this just kind of shows you that, this is a very tight loop of, moving in, and you've got resin and, making a product in a package, and that then is pulled back in as a recycled product. But we also have to take into account that the cost to reclaim this is a real driver on whether or not someone can use it, as well as the cost to landfill is so low that we also have another price driver that sometimes makes it easier to just throw away a scrap plastic as opposed to try to pull it back in. And what we're seeing as a recycling rate for all plastics is about 8.5%, which, by any measure, if you were talking about a kid in school or any other marker, is not really what anybody would consider to be a passing grade. And so I think that there's some real effort that needs to be put forward to really trying to figure out how all of the drivers work together. And I'm going to use a couple of slides and some graphics from IHS Markit, and they've got some stats from a new study, Changing Course, Plastics, Carbon, and the Transition to Circularity, that I think really help convey what we've got coming beyond 2021. Typically, historically, 2% of gas and 7% of oil has been used in petrochemicals, i.e. chemicals, and then plastics. But what we see is a prediction that refined oil and gas products is predicted to flatten in the next couple of decades, and that there's a kind of predicted growth in plastics to kind of fill in some of that gap in the fossil fuel industry. And kind of what we see is expecting that growth in plastics is, on the left, the status quo of recycling infrastructure and technology and infrastructure is never going to keep pace with that. And so what we really need to see is a significant acceleration and growth in infrastructure and policy and technology and just ideas to help move us forward to even be able to meet the targets. And so we're really going to have to work hard in the coming decades to keep pace with the plastics. And then just wanted to talk a little bit about the trends related to the pandemic. What we see is a real decrease in the short term in non-durable plastics, which is where a lot of recycled plastics can go: automotive and transportation, industrial applications, construction materials, consumer goods and appliances, that can really use plastics of different grades that can be mixed together into something that's really durable. And a lot of the single-use plastics, especially related to medical and food, really we are looking at virgin plastics being pulled into that because of the use and that kind of the parts of that need to be controlled related to toxics and other materials that are touching or are being ingested or that sort of thing. And so we also know that COVID-19 has probably made the ocean plastics problem worse as well. And so there's different pieces here tied in together that we need to work through. But this kind of speaks to, this is another IHS Markit graph, the importance of recycling, especially as we're talking about climate action and climate change. The avoidance of CO2 emissions related to using recycled content is so incredible. These two bars on the right are either HDPE from ethane or from naphtha, so you don't really have to worry about the source so much as other than to say on the left, you can see the difference between the energy and the use of creating the HDPE when it's recycled versus when it's a virgin product. And even, you kind of get in the middle when you're talking about blends, because you're not necessarily talking about using 100% HDPE in something. So you may see a 20-80 blend or a 50-50 blend. So you can still see significant changes in, making a blend in the carbon avoidance of that, as long as you're using some recycled content. And the same is true for PET. And what you see here is on the far left, mechanical recycled rPET, and the carbon avoidance, the CO2 avoidance. And in the middle, it's a blend. It's a PET virgin blend with 30% rPET, and you can still see that there's a significant 28% CO2 avoidance compared to just regular virgin. So I think it's really critical that we keep in mind that recycling is a business, but it's also really critical for climate action. And one of the things that I want to kind of move into, though, is, how do we deal with the problem, and what are some of the solutions to help us drive a recycling market for plastics that's healthy, robust, and kind of benefits everyone, the environment, but also those companies and businesses that are in the middle. And solutions have to be on the same scale as the problem. And so this chart on the right-hand side is just for polyolefins. So this is just polypropylene and polyethylene. And these are just the 10 largest virgin producers. And you can see, compared to our recycling capacity, we're only at about 5% of what's being put out by just the 10 largest producers. That's not even a global number, and this is not for all plastics. And so our solutions really have to scale up, and we really need to be thinking much bigger and much broader than what we're managing right now. And I think a great place to start is just to even talk about PET recycling in general. So the blue bar on the left, there's about 6 billion PET bottles available in the US in a given year. And then on the far right, where you see the black bar, that's how many of those are disposed of. So if you've got a recycling rate at roughly 30% nationally, that means 70% of PET bottles are not pulled into the system to be recycled. So the only things that are really pulled in is at the very bottom, where you kind of see the rainbow of colors, into these various streams of fiber like polyester and polyfill, sheets and film, strapping, other food and beverage containers are going back into a bottle, and then some other non-food bottles and other end uses. So I think we have, even in a highly developed recycling program for PET bottles, a lot of work to do to get that black bar much smaller and to really close the loop and pull these bottles back into the system. And it's also one of the things that we've seen with our recycling survey is that we're seeing a trend where segregated non-bottle rigids, so these kind of items that you see on the right, yogurt containers, tubs, lids, thermoforms, and coffee jugs or coffee containers and canisters, when we see them being separated, whether they're from a commercial source separated, i.e. all the HDPE goes together, all the PET goes somewhere, and polypropylene goes somewhere else, even if they're baled and then put on the same truck, the fact that a processor can open a bale of a commodity and it's exactly the same thing, have stronger markets, and there's a lot more of that stuff actually being pulled through into the recycling system. And then you can see, so that's the green piece of the pie. And then what we see is mixed rigid bales, which is the kind of darker orange, is only about 16% of the total, meaning that they have a much weaker market pull within the United States in 2018. And we've also seen similar numbers related to film, PE clear film, and also the retail bags and films, which are source separated by the consumer and taken back to the retail store. Those are the only two categories of film that we actually saw growth from 2017 to 2018, and I believe we're going to see, somewhat of a same trend moving forward. But those final numbers have not been put out for 2019. But you can see for things like curbside film, ag films, and colored films that are mixed, we did see a drop. And so successful recycling requires demand and supply, right? Here are all the different players that are in orange, the stakeholders within the value chain, and then the roles they, the roles they do, and they produce quality feedstock that's then made into other new packages and used by brands and producers, and consumers buy them off the shelf. And so that's the really critical piece. We're, in a very American sort of way, we have to buy ourselves out of a recycling problem. We have to be able to commit to using recycled content and putting them in things and being able to kind of absorb some of that cost, whether it's at the brand level or passed on to the consumer. But we're not going to solve the recycling problem just by recycling it. We have to really be committed to the recycled content. And one of the things that we've done for more is we've created the recycling market development platform called Circularity in Action to really start the process and to provide the tools that really help businesses, consumers, governments, any player within the stakeholder within the value chain on how the role that you play in helping to get to circularity. Because one product can have a really big impact on demand. This is an example of if garbage bags in the US used recycled content HDPE. On the far left, it tells you how much post-consumer resin, the PCR level, 10, 30, 70, 97%. how much material that would pull out of the system. So at 30%, that would be 1.8 billion pounds of HDPE or polyethylene. And that would be 90% or 95% of the total polyethylene currently reclaimed. And I think this was done in 2017. So you could see that this has a tremendous impact. It's just one place and one sector and one product that could really have a real driving force behind the demand within plastics recycling. And to that point, buying recycled matters. And so we've also got a buy recycled products directory, as well as APR has the demand champions, of which NERC and Lynn help coordinate with government demand champions and, committing to buying recycled products. And really, it's not hard to commit to it, but I think a lot of times consumers don't make the connection between what they put in their cart and the fact that it comes back on the shelf as another product. And that's not just for plastics, it's aluminum, paper, and glass, really making the commitment and the connection between it just doesn't go into the box in the bin and it's magically, taken away. There is something that has to happen to it. We really need that pull through. And so, the general drivers for change are going to be things like Basel Convention, global plastics treaties, the plastic pact here in the US, anything that's coming out of the new administration, state and local policies, and just different drivers, and verifying that PCR is actually post-consumer resin and not something that's passed off in that way. And we really need to be committed to, I think, some pretty significant changes within our toolkit, and that not any one policy has to happen everywhere, but there can be policy pieces and drivers and work from brands and governments together, to Joe's point about public-private partnerships really have to work to really solve this problem. And this is just a map of extended producer responsibility. The upper right-hand corner is from 2000, and it just kind of shows you that EPR was really just in Europe. But now you're starting to see this kind of rainbow of colors of different sorts of EPR and producer responsibility schemes that are coming up in different places. And you can see that the US is yellow, which means that we're kind of in this emergence. We don't really have any set policy yet, but it's being talked about. And so you can see that the map is really shifting and understanding that producers do play a role in recycling and how we move forward with that.
Tanya, I hate to interrupt, but
yes,
are you going about winding up?
Yes.
Thank you.
I have. So I'll just go through these really quickly. The U.S. Plastics Pact obviously is a big player that's emerging in the U.S. Information can be found at their website. Basel Convention highlights, again, these slides will be shared. I don't really have to go into them. We're not a signatory, but it is something that we could, expect. And then also Washington Plastic Study, how do we solve plastic problems? At the state level, Plastics Markets is a resource that we provide to connect buyers and sellers of plastics. And then here are the conclusions that you can read on your own. Basically, we got to work together to solve this problem. And that's it. Thank you, Lynn.
Great, Tanya. That was like an avalanche in a positive way of information. That was great. I think we probably also want to acknowledge that APR yesterday, I believe, launched a brand new buy recycled program focused directly on your average consumer. So that is great news as well. So with that, we're going to turn it to Hannah and make her the presenter. And again, thank you so much, Tanya. And now we're going to hear from Hannah. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you. Let's see. Trying to show my screen. Okay. So can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's not in slideshow. Are you able to do that?
I think so.
Yes, you did it. Dandy.
Okay.
Thank you. We're all set.
Great. Thank you. All right, so thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Chaz, for this opportunity to share my view with everyone in the webinar. I will just go directly to the recovered paper market. First, let's look at the OCC market, which was full of changes and surprise in the past few years. So China announced its new recovered paper import regulations in 2017, and then a few other Asian countries like Indonesia, they announced a different sort of import restrictions around 2019. So all of those regulations affected US recovered paper export significantly. So we saw US OCC price decline sharply in 2018 and 19, and then fell to their lowest level in 2 decades at the end of last year. And then, the end of 2019. And then the COVID pandemic started to hit the US market in 2020. From March to May, the supply was disrupted seriously. And meanwhile, the OCC demand was very strong at that time. So paper mills were running at very high speed to fulfill the demand for paper packaging, as both the public and also, all the consumers and also the commercial sectors, they were trying to restock everything, all kinds of products. And also COVID-19 has accelerated the growth of e-commerce. Just give you an example, I received about $5 per week before the pandemic, but this number at least doubled during the pandemic. So now I basically buy everything online. And the fast growing e-commerce means more demand for packaging, particularly paper packaging, container board. And the strong demand for container board eventually transferred to strong demand for OCC. On the supply side, the fast growing e-commerce means more boxes being delivered to households where OCC is more likely to be contaminated and the sorting cost could increase. So overall supply reduction in commercial sector, and we saw growing volume in the residential collection channels. So we can see the sharp price increase for US OCC from last March to May. And then as most states reopened their economies around May, OCC supply recovered and the demand supply balance relaxed to some extent, and OCC price fell in June and July. But soon Chinese import demand started to pick up as Chinese paper companies tried to basically took their last chance to import US OCC before China's import ban. And this helped stabilize, even raise the OCC price in the US during August and September. And when Chinese purchase fade away around October, so many people, including myself, thought that there could be some sharp decline in US OCC price, but that didn't happen. For one thing, US paper mills, they start to run at high speed again to get prepared for the upcoming holiday season. And another thing was other Asia, including like India and Southeast Asia, they started to increase their imports of recovered paper in the fall after being very, very quiet for most of the spring and summer. So the strong demand from both domestic paper mills and also from like non-China Asia helped hold the US OCC markets even when China imports went away completely. And then at the end of last year and at the beginning of this year, many people thought the OCC supply increase during the holiday season could drag OCC price down. But again, it didn't happen. In fact, the US OCC price, the average price increased by about $8 in December and rose by another $9 in January. And US mills continued to run quickly with no clear signs of slowing down. India and Southeast Asia, they were extremely hungry for fiber, and they have been willing to accept a big price increase as long as they can get the fiber. So as Joe mentioned, the international shipping has been a big problem in the, at least in the recycled paper industry. The container shortage caused a serious delay and cancellation in shipping. So the paper mills in Southeast Asia, they were not able to get their imported OCC on time. And at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic in that region impacted their own local OCC collection. So OCC price just surged, and some mills had to shut down because of no fiber in Southeast Asia. So one thing I want to mention is that the OCC sent to India and Southeast Asia to some extent went to China eventually. For example, US OCC were sent to paper mills and recycled paper mills in Southeast Asia. And these OCC were utilized to make recycled pulp and containerboard. And all of the recycled pulp and some of the containerboard will then be delivered to China. So although China stopped recovered paper imports completely at the end of last year, but its impacts on US recovered paper market will not go away. All right, so to summarize, we can see that OCC domestic demand in US increased by about 3% last year after dropping by 2% in 2019. This was much more than many people's expectation, given that we were struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic nearly the whole year. And on a monthly or quarterly basis, we can see from the chart at the bottom, we can see the very strong demand in the first quarter and the final quarter of last year. On the export sector, US OCC exports fell by about 14% in 2019, and then declined by another 13% in the first 11 months of 2020. And exports to China dropped by 14% last year, and much slower than the 30% decline we saw in 2018. So we can see that in general, Chinese paper mills, they love US OCC. When they have the chance, they would love to buy a lot of US OCC. Other Asia is another huge buyer of US OCC, and exports to other Asia declined by about 14% last year after surging by 100% in 2018 and growing by 6% in 2019. And on a monthly basis, you can see the rebounding Asian demand in the second half of last year, and that's provide a lot of support for to stabilize and even increasing US OCC price. Something about mixed paper. We all know that mixed paper price fell sharply in 18 and 19 because of China's mixed paper ban and also other Asia's also to import restriction. US paper mills, they have tried to utilize more mixed paper, but the growth in domestic demand was not strong enough to stabilize the overall market. So the pandemic somehow kind of changed the mixed paper market. When OCC and SOP supply was really tight in last spring, more paper producers tried to use more mixed paper because of its low cost. So US mixed paper price finally started to trend up in March and moved out of a negative territory in May. And the Asian import price, if you can see the red line, started to jump in August when that region's demand rebounded. And during the past 6 months, Asian import price surged from $50 in July to more than $165 this month. So you can tell from this that Asia is extremely hungry for fiber for now. This chart, the chart on the top shows the growing US domestic demand for mixed paper, and the bottom one can tell you the mixed paper demand has been steady in the US despite all kinds of change in the market. Mixed paper exports, no surprise. It was hit very hard by Asia's regulations. Total exports declined by 26% in 18 and 7% last year. And for this year, we saw another 25% decline. From the monthly data, again, you can see that mixed paper exports to other Asia rebounded quite strongly in the second half of last year, sorry. And this to some extent tells us the doors were still open to most of Asian countries, particularly when the demand became strong. A little bit about high grades, like sorted office paper. It was another big, or I can see another superstar during the COVID-19 pandemic. Supply was reduced sharply from because of school were closed, many people worked from home. But at the same time, when we look at the demand from tissue mills, it was good in the spring, when everyone was trying to stock all kinds of tissue products. But the demand for SOP got very weak after the spring because people continue to stay at home and many restaurants remain closed. So the demand for away from home tissue suffered a lot in the second half of last year, and that impacted the demand for SOP a lot. So as a result, we saw price for SOP after it surged by $100 in 2 months, it started to fall in June and basically fall continually through December. And until the beginning of this month, when the mills, the domestic tissue mills started to buy SOP again, we saw the price start to stabilize and recovered a little bit at the beginning of this year. So overall, U.S. demand for de-inking high grades dropped by about 7% last year, and exports were also weak, declined by about 20%. So we know that de-inking high grades mainly come from the consumption of printing and writing paper consumption, which plunged by 22% last year because of the pandemic and also because of the continuous switch from paper to digital. So the concern is that the pandemic has accelerated the decline of printing and writing paper demand, and its impact may not go away even after the pandemic. So the supply of high grades of recovered paper could be a problem in the medium and in the long term. Okay, so the left chart shows U.S. containerboard production. You can see the significant increase in 2020. And we expect to see further increase in containerboard output in this year and next year. During the past 2 years, we saw significant addition in recycled fiber-based containerboard capacity. And for this year and next 2 years, there will be new containerboard projects as well. And all of those will support further growth in U.S. OCC demand. In addition to containerboard, U.S. has about 2 million tons of recycled pulp capacity planned. Some of them have started up or has been running partially, but the majority of those recycled pulp capacity will start up this year or early next year. This will be like another boost for U.S. domestic recovered paper demand, especially for OCC and mixed paper. And you can see from the right chart that U.S. recycled pulp exports increased sharply in the last 2 years. Although it's still small, but it will grow sharply soon because the recycled pulp will be a new way for China to basically obtain the recycled fiber they need. Okay, now let's talk about China. Chinese recovered paper imports fell by about 33% last year, after falling by nearly 40% in 2019. By source, Chinese imports from North America, mainly the US, dropped by only 16% last year, but its imports from Japan and Western Europe declined by about 22% and 80% respectively. So apparently, as mentioned earlier, the high virgin fiber content of US RCP, especially US OCC, is very attractive to Chinese paper producers. While Chinese recovered paper imports fell sharply, Chinese recycled pulp imports surged from pretty much zero in 2017 to about 1 million tons last year, and to about 1 million tons in 2019. And for 2020, Chinese recycled pulp imports increased again by about 80%. So far, most of Chinese recycled pulp imports came from other Asia, such as Southeast Asia and like South Korea. And overall, US accounted for about 15% of Chinese total recycled pulp purchase. So in total, about 7 million tons of recycled pulp projects were announced or planned, and most of them in the US and Southeast Asia. But some projects are still kind of up in the air without any detail on the start date or location. Because right now, China's policy, like import policy on recycled pulp is still unclear. So there will be some kind of like uncertainty about recycled pulp investments. Okay, so as China reduced its recovered paper imports, other Asia imports increased sharply over the last few years. And this region's total recovered paper imports surged from about 7 million tons in 2016 to 14 million tons in 2018, so doubled in 2 years. And imports slowed in 2019 due to the slowed demand growth and some countries' regulations to restrict RCP imports. For example, Indonesia, its policy has impacted its recovered paper imports significantly. And India and South Korea, they also announced some kind of policy to control recovered paper imports, but so far we think their doors are still open as long as the quality is okay. And for 2020, the total net imports are estimated to have dropped a little, mainly because of the COVID-19, which slowed their demand and also created many logistic problems during the trade. So overall, other Asia has surpassed China and become the #1 recovered paper buyer in the world. And it's reasonable for this region to care more about the quality, to care more about the environmental impact of like recovered paper imports. But we think this region still has big potential to increase its imports further because of its faster growing demand for recovered paper. And Vietnam recently announced that it will ban mixed paper imports by the end of this year. We're not sure whether that's going to happen or not, but that's kind of like a signal for kind of tougher quality control on imported recovered paper. This chart shows the increasing share of imports in other Asia's total recovered paper demand. Some countries in this region still have very inefficient paper recycling systems, and their domestic collection cannot catch up with their strong demand growth for recovered paper. Also, as large amount of paper packaging materials go out of this region, together with their exported like clothes, shoes, and toys, and this region needs to buy some recovered paper back to keep their fiber demand and supply balanced. So, and another thing is recycled pulp, recycled pulp lines in this region. They also need recovered paper. So we think at least in the near term, other Asia has to expand their recovered paper imports to support the development of their paper industry. Okay, so this chart shows other Asia's containerboard production and net exports. We can see over the past few years, this region's containerboard production increased very quickly, and its containerboard exports increased very quickly as well, mainly to support the growing demand from Asia. And all of those indicated that this region's recovered paper demand and imports will remain strong in the near term. So during the last few years, total Asian imports declined, total US exports dropped, but the trade volume remained huge. On a global wise, the share of trade in in recovered paper demand dropped from about 24% in 2016 to 20% in 2019 and slipped further in last year. But we are sure that international trade will continue to be a very important player in the global recovered paper markets and in the US market. And US will remain the key region to export recovered paper. Okay, just very quick summary. On a worldwide expanding recycled containerboard production base will continue to drive up the demand for recovered paper, especially OCC and mixed paper. And US mills will expand its recovered paper consumption through its new paper capacity and through their recycled pulp lines. By that, they can reduce their reliance on recovered paper exports. For other Asia and China, they will continue to buy a lot of recycled fiber through recovered paper or through recycled pulp. So overall, trade regulations from other Asia may bring considerable uncertainty or risk to the global and US markets. And in the near term, the COVID-19 and also the international shipping industry, the problem in that industry could continue to bring a lot of up and downs to the market. All right, that's all from me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to ask that all the speakers, I guess that includes myself, put their cameras on. And I know we have lots of questions, but I'm going to ask that go ahead, people can put more people in there if they more questions in the box if they want. And Chaz, I think that you had some questions that you wanted to start us with.
Yeah, I want to start off with a question for Joe, and it has to do with e-commerce and how you think e-commerce is going to trend over the next 5 years.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chaz. That's a great question. I think the longer term trend in e-commerce sales is undeniable, and that's a growth trajectory, and that's in part certainly because of the convenience of shopping online, which we're all enjoying, I assume, these days. It's kind of an interesting development in 2020, in that there's kind of an inverse relationship a little bit between e-commerce sales and the impact of the COVID pandemic on the economy. So in the second quarter of last year, the economy contracted, more than 30%, and e-commerce sales spiked. Within the third quarter, we saw the economy rebounding, and e-commerce sales starting to slow. So as the economy overall sort of got back on track, and as the pandemic's influence on the recession started to wane, that was inversely moving towards e-commerce sales. But that's kind of obviously 2020 was an unusual year on a number of fronts. I think longer term, the demand for online shopping is going to continue to grow. And that has important implications, not just for the old corrugated containers that Hannah was talking about, but for definitely for the supply shifts that we're seeing on the intake of recyclables.
Hannah, any thoughts about e-commerce and its continuing impact on paper?
I agree with Joe. I mean, it's just based on what we have seen, the data, e-commerce data and overall paper packaging data. So basically, e-commerce has been growing for quite a few years, but what we saw last year, it accelerated a lot. And so based on, my colleague, the paper packaging export, based on their analysis, they don't think, when the pandemic go away, actually, we may not see like the e-commerce slow down. So basically we're seeing continuous, very, a strong growth in commerce even after the pandemic. And that's going to be a big driver for like the paper packaging. And that will also have a lot of impact on the OCC demand and supply.
And Tanya, how do you think that will play out on the plastic side? Do you see more plastics as part of e-packaging?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen already. There is a particular very large gorilla in the room that sends out a lot of packages that are in bubble wrap that happen to have the how to recycle label on it, and the growth in the amount of referrals that we get from their website that send us to the drop-off directory on how to recycle that. Definitely, we've seen a significant growth since they added that label to that package, and then obviously there's air pillows and bubble wrap and other packaging pieces that are plastic within a cardboard box. And so, yes, there's definitely been a lot of, I think, additional thoughts about especially the flexible films that are coming in as part of packaging and seeing a growth in that and seeing consumers trying to figure out how to recycle that.
I've got a question. Start off with Hannah, but also Tanya definitely pitch in, and Joe also. Recycled content. We're seeing legislation introduced that has some extraordinary goals. 70 to 80% recycled content for all paper products. I've seen that being introduced. I've seen some pretty dramatic goals on the plastic side. What do you see as the limit to the ability of the paper industry and the plastic industry to use recycled content? Where do you think in the best possible conditions that would be?
Okay, so that's a very, very interesting question, Chaz. I can start with paper. So as I mentioned in my presentation, for example, for printing and writing paper, everyone, we now use less and less like the copy paper every day because of the shift from paper to digital, and that will feed. But the printing and writing paper will feed to recycle the tissue production. So if we wanted to have more like higher recycled content in tissue products, that's going to be a problem because we don't have the supply for that paper, for sorted office paper. So that's for the print and writing paper or tissue side. And for packaging side, so overall, US has the lowest recycled fiber content in containerboard industry in the world. The reason is US has a lot of wood resource, and it's cheap and it's super good quality. So it's not like China, they don't have forest resource and they just have to, they have no other choice but have to use OCC. But in US, they have the option, they have the very good quality wood fiber, and which is cheaper and good quality. So I don't know, how reasonable, to put a very high recycled fiber content for paper packaging. And another thing is, basically, I mentioned many times during my presentation, US, like a Chinese paper producer, they love US OCC because US OCC has high virgin fiber content that help them to run their paper machines smoothly. But if, one day US OCC become the same as Chinese OCC, so how the worldwide containerboard industry will keep their fiber balance, that's going to be not only a US problem, that's going to be a global problem.
Tanya?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, the same, virgin plastic is fit for use in just about every, every place, and it's very cheap, and so there's a couple of drivers here. And plus, like I said, all plastic's not created equal. There's a big difference between a polyolefin, so polypropylene and polyethylene, and PET in the way that they're recycled. You can make 100% PET bottle because of solid stating and just kind of the chemical properties of PET. And I was just on a webinar with PRE, Plastics Recyclers Europe, yesterday. There's bottle manufacturers already that are using 100% PET or recycled content PET bottles. So the technology is there for PET to be at 100%. The supply is not necessarily there to feed that machine all the time, but the idea of seeing a recycled bottle made out of 100% HDPE and polypropylene, I don't think that we're at that level yet. And so I think fitting recycled content mandates to reflect the actual technology and to reflect what the supply is. But I think if we want really high PET rates of recycled content, we're going to have to work on the policy piece of how we get more of that stuff back, because a 30% recycling rate for PET bottles is not going to drive a 60% mandate, because we're just not going to have enough bottles for it.
Joe, did you have any thoughts on that, or?
I would agree with my fellow panelists here. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, good. My little connectivity issues on this end, but you know, I thought Tanya's slide in terms of market share, if we're at different levels of recycled content in her presentation was, you know, spot on in terms of there are restrictions and limitations on how much material is currently available for processing. There's a lot of upside for sure, but there's also a real need for additional investment to get material that would have typically been shipped overseas, which wasn't necessarily of the same high quality, to get that process to a quality that's going to be acceptable to domestic manufacturers. And I think we're going to have to see that, you know, basically across the commodity spectrum.
Yeah, just one quick comment before I hand this over to Lynn, because Lynn's got access to all the questions. We did have a lot of, and we still do on the books, have a lot of recycled content requirements for newsprint. And they certainly did not, they certainly helped in the 90s in terms of newsprint markets. But one thing they did not guarantee was market stability. The price was still subject to all the fluctuations of the international economy. So just a thought. Lynn, take it away with the question.
Well, and to that point too, Chaz, it didn't, you know, newsprint's kind of a thing of a past too, right? Like even though, you know, we were all reading newspapers 20 years ago, we don't really read a newspaper anymore. So even though it's required to have recycled content, there's just not the same demand pull too.
Yep.
So, you know, as was alluded to, we have a lot of questions, and so we might as well start apologizing now. We're not asking all these questions, so we're going to be focusing kind of on, you know, some of the themes. So the question I'm about to ask has been asked by people about specifically about paper and specifically about plastic. So I'm going to ask it in general, and then I think we could also hear from Joe, which is, let's say we really got our act together and started recycling. Human beings in the United States, recycling. Do we have the capacity to recycle it in the United States? And the inverse question was also asked, which is that would we be overwhelming the new capacity announcements? Now that one was specifically about paper, but of course there's been announcements about plastic as well. So where does individuals' recycling behavior play into the reality of the recycling industry? Anybody can go first. Fight about it.
Go ahead,
Ladies
Hannah.
first.
Yeah, well, I can talk about paper a little bit. I mean, I think the difference between paper and plastic is even for now, US has pretty good paper recycling rate. So if we use different kind of calculation way, we can get like 70% or even sometimes even go to 80% recycling rate. If you compare that number with Japan or with Europe, that's not good. But if you compare with, you know, the general developing countries, we're in a good position. But I think still there is, for the future, the concern I have is, you know, if the e-commerce grow very fast, you know, continually in the future, so that's going to cause some issues like quality, both quality and cost. Because, you know, it's easier to collect like old corrugated boxes from like a shopping mall, from supermarkets, but it's going to be more difficult to collect from like the households. So, you know, how high the paper or OCC recovery rate can go, I think we have a lot of potential to go up, but the quality concern and the cost concern will be something.
And the capacity, we have the capacity, available capacity currently to manage that domestically?
I definitely think we, at least, you know, to support, I mean, overall, we have quite a lot of actually like oversupply of recovered paper. That's why we export a lot to Asia. So I think, you know, in general, it's easier to recycle paper than to recycle plastic. That, well, if maybe I'm wrong, but that's my like impression. So I think we have the capacity to do that.
Okay, great. So thank you. So Tanya, you showed a slide. It was a fairly horrifying, as were many of your slides, a fairly horrifying slide.
Sorry.
Discrepancy between the available
Tanya.
reclamation capacity versus the virgin capacity. So,
Yeah.
but that little horrible 5% number that was there, is that enough capacity for how much we currently recycle, or do we need more capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I think for what we're currently recycling, it's we're doing pretty well, right? It's the lower grade plastics that suffer, but the even HDPE colored and polypropylene that are kind of mixed consumer grade materials that are different sizes and shapes still have markets. When you're talking about mixed bales, that's where the capacity really falls off. The idea of a 3-through-7 bale or a 1-through-7 bale or a bulky rigid bale, that processing, we don't have enough of it in the US for what we actually could capture. And the same thing with like MRF film, right? Like there's a lot of material that if we could figure out how to take film through a MRF and recycle that, we could recycle a lot more film. But so I think the higher the grade and the higher the quality product, the more capacity we have and we could absorb more because it's easier to process it. It's as you start to trickle down and you get away from really high quality, that the capacity doesn't exist. And if we wanted to recycle more of that, which is why I think the contamination rates are high at MRFs, because they're letting a lot of plastics go off the end because we don't have a way to process those.
Okay, so we have a few questions also that relate to subsidies. So Tanya, you said that there are $1 trillion in subsidies for the virgin petroleum industry. And I wondered if that was domestic only or international.
It's global.
Global, good. I mean, that's better.
It's still a lot of money.
That's still a lot of money, right? And so, and have we seen subsidies for the use of recycled content fiber in carpet? Have we seen changes there? And has that affected that industry's ability to use PET?
Well, I mean, I think the carpet industry has been really in recycled content for a really long time. I don't think it's necessarily been subsidized. I think they have just found it to be, there's a very large manufacturer in the Southeast that's pulling a lot of PET out of the Southeast, regionally and that sort of thing. So I think the other pieces is that we also see fiber going into a lot of clothing, polyester clothing and fleece. And the idea that you can make a sustainable jacket out of a bottle is a big selling point for a lot of brands. And so I don't think that those are necessarily being subsidized, certainly not to the extent that fossil fuels is. I think what we're going to see is for, again, smaller, lower grade niche plastics, where the subsidy difference between your output of a product and the cost to process it, that's where the subsidy plays a much bigger role.
Okay, thanks. So we only have a couple of minutes, and so I'm going to ask what I'm going to say facetiously is a really small question for Joe. The new Basel restriction on plastic. So
don't you have a different question for me?
I do have a different question. So do you have links to your data? That was another question you had. So, well, the answer to that was yes. So first of all, did the statistics that you gave about plastic, did that already reflect anticipated changes in the flow of plastic as a result of that new treaty?
So the new treaty came into effect in January.
Yeah.
So the day that I was presenting was through November, but I
Okay.
think the longer term trend in terms of plastic scrap exports was the writing was already on the wall, and I think Tanya touched on that a little bit already. So short answer is no, it didn't include that. But the trend is, not going to. We're still trending downward either way.
Okay, great, thank you. And Hannah, what is mixed paper turned into?
Mixed paper basically right now can be used to make anything. So now it's, but the majority of its end use is cotton board or box board. And container board. So like the cherry box.
Yeah.
The mixed paper content, the cherry box is made from mixed paper. But now, even tissue mills use some mixed paper.
Okay, great. Thank you. So honestly, lots of really great questions here, but your presentations were too good, so we didn't cut them off. So we're not going to be able to get to them, but I will share the questions that people asked with the speakers, and if they elect to, they'll be able to respond directly. The presentations and the recording will be on the NERC website homepage by tonight. So, and you will get an email from GoToWebinar tomorrow reminding you of that fact. So that is there. I definitely want to again thank our sponsors, ADS, Vanguard, Casella, and ISRI, and to note that NERC has more webinars coming up. Next week, we have one on collecting organics, and then in early March, we have one specifically about film recycling, meaning plastic bag type film, not the flexible packaging type film. And Tanya is going to be one of the speakers on that. And you can register for those free webinars on the NERC homepage. And with that, boy, just the biggest of thanks to all of our speakers and to Chaz, whose idea this was to do this. And a great presentation, everybody. And it's a tad early, but we'll say have a good weekend. And thanks for supporting NERC's webinars. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.